À-bas-le-ciel.
I personally would ask you, do you think culture dictates morality?
Yeah, I think that it can do, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing in all cases because it has proven to be in the past. I think that it comes on a case by case basis.
Both explicitly and implicitly, a large part of what we deal with in veganism are questions of cultural change. How do you stimulate a change in modern Western culture? So it's interesting that so many vegans deal with it so poorly when they're taken out of the familiar confines of Western culture and, are just challenged by saying, hey, what about Aboriginal Australian culture? What about Indigenous culture here or there? What about a contrast between more than one particular type of culture? We should be totally self-confident and comfortable in dealing with these questions, but it seems that many of us are not. Now, I have addressed this on the channel before. A relatively popular video on my channel, i.e. popular when you consider how obscure and specific this subject matter is, was titled, quote, "Stop Treating Native Americans Like Infants," close quote. And that video, which you can look up, it's impressive that over 2,000 people watched it because this is a really specific question that I think only would be asked within the vegan movement by vegan activists thinking about how they can broach and cope with these ideas and these challenges, how they can deal with challenges when they either come from white Western people offering the traditions of Indigenous peoples as a justification for modern white Western people, just continuing what's traditional for them also. But how do you deal with it when these questions, comments, or complaints come from people who are themselves members of Indigenous minority cultures, whether in the United States, Canada, or in this case, Australia?
The majority of people who live in the global south, who don't have education
Yeah.
surrounding veganism, who perhaps are unable to make that choice, it constitutes an unnecessary value judgment on things that may necessarily be an important part of their culture. My mother comes from an Indigenous culture, and it's an important part of their culture that they ritualize the killing of that animal and they treat it respectfully and they hate it. That constitutes value judgment on that. And when they can't make that choice to have a vegan thing or to do that because of their circumstances, it tells those people that they're necessarily worth less than other people who can because you come from a place of privilege.
As with every single question that Joey took from the audience in this video, my reply, my answer, if I had been there, if I had been the one doing the Q&A session, is completely, utterly different. Not just in terms of style, but also in terms of substance. When this particular student challenges me, if hypothetically, if I'm the one taking the question, that a vegan diet is a privilege, I would absolutely embrace that fact. I would say, yes, it is a privilege. Washing your hands with soap and water is a privilege. Brushing your teeth with a toothbrush and toothpaste is a privilege. And I hope that you, with your tribe, with your hometown, wherever it is you come from, as an Indigenous person, because this person identifies as connected to some Indigenous group of people within Australia, I hope all of your people have access to soap and toothpaste and toothbrushes, even though it's utterly alien to your tradition. And in fact, if either the government or the free market is failing to provide your people with access to soap and water, hygiene, the real basic fundamental benefits of science that modern Western civilization now takes for granted, I think that would be a travesty. And I would get up on my soapbox and get articles in the newspaper saying, hey, here's this group of people, whether they're on a native reservation in Canada or in maybe Northwest Australia or something. Here's a group of people who don't even have access to soap and toothpaste. This is terrible. This is unspeakable. So yes, it is a privilege. Yes, it's something that's the product of scientific progress in recent centuries. And it's something we're discussing here and now with reference to the future. I think it's very important in all these discussions to shift them towards an aesthetic of futurity. I'm not going to sit here and debate with you what I would do if I were born 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, when technologically, in many cases, there were no substitutes for example, leather. Today, leather is completely obsolete, but certainly an argument to be made that 1,000 years ago it was impossible to have an entirely vegan society because of the ways in which civilizations relied on the exploitations of animals for labor and for these kinds of raw materials. But regardless, whether or not it was possible 1,000 years ago, it was desirable. And today, it's not just desirable, it's attainable. And yes, I'd like you and your people in the next 1,000 years to join in the benefits of this the same way I'm inviting you to join in using soap, toothbrushes, toothpaste, and so on. So this is the positive side of the argument in relation to challenges to cultural traditions. For all of us, even within Europe, when people first encountered the technology of soap, it was a challenge to our cultural traditions. People first encountered toothpaste, and when people first learned that tobacco was terrible for them, I mean, there's two waves of that. When they first encountered tobacco, that's recorded history, and then when they discovered that tobacco wasn't good for your health, that it had no medicinal properties, that it was actually terrible for your health. These were all challenges to cultural tradition, one after another. We live in an era with changing attitudes towards tobacco, changing attitudes towards alcohol, and yes, fundamentally, changing attitudes towards meat, agriculture, animal ethics, ecology, etc. These are things that are changing. These are things we have to question, looking ahead to the future. These aren't value judgments on the past and traditions of your people, and they're not really value judgments on the past and tradition of my people. I used to study Korean Ojibwe at First Nations University, Canada, where sometimes everybody else in the room was Indigenous except me. Since there were a couple white people. I have no Native American ancestry. But, I'd be surrounded by these people. And I remember at one point I said to somebody, came up spontaneously in the conversation, I said, you do realize that my people also used to hunt with bows and arrows. Like, they would be talking about these things as if it were a unique problem or a unique legacy or a unique ethical burden they were dealing with in their culture alone. It's like, no, the history of England also was built on hunting and specifically archery. Archery is a huge part of the cultural tradition and so on in England. These are also, traditions where we had to adapt, and, they were once a huge part of our identity. All right. This is sort of the positive side of it. Now, the negative side is, because with these types of discussions about culture, the selection of examples is really very important. So look at an example like circumcision. Circumcision is not unique to Judaism. It's not unique to Islam. It's not unique to the monotheistic religions. The Aboriginal people of Australia have horrifying traditions of male circumcision. Truly horrifying. And the same type of language employed by this question here, the same type of rhetoric, can be used to justify male circumcision as a cultural tradition. Right? This is the most basic, terrifying, unforgivable thing of, mutilating the genitals of a newborn baby or a young child, right? Can be justified in this same way. Should it be justified? Will it be justified? Isn't it a very different thing to rationalize it when looking back historically and say, well, why did our people do this in the past? Why did this group of people do this in the past? And today, here and now, to try to rationalize it and enforce it on children looking forward in the name of tradition, right? Yes, the discovery of modern medical science is a challenge to these traditions, but one of the worst ways you can evade the implications of modernity, of rational and scientific thinking, is precisely to try to offer excuses for tradition in the guise of scientific reasoning. And that's gone on within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam now for more than a century, of people trying to claim that circumcision can be carried out for hygienic reasons, for medical reasons, that it's a legitimate form of surgery or medical procedure. And it's not. It's not a legitimate medical procedure. It's not even a legitimate form of cosmetic surgery. This is something that removes about 50% of the nerve endings in the penis. This is something that does permanent physical damage to infants, and that can only be justified by appealing to a mode of magical, superstitious reasoning that people today rightly feel ashamed of. Yeah. So within Australia, for the Aboriginal people of Australia, they look back at their history and they have this truly nightmare-inducing tradition of male circumcision. You can Google it if you want to. You might prefer not to. It's horrifying to behold what their circumcision tradition entails. They had a long history of this. And the question is today, should this not merely be part of the past, but should this be part of the present and the future? Okay? So this is a challenge to ethical assumptions that every culture in the world has to deal with. We all have to take responsibility for the decisions we're making here and now with the access to information that we have here and now. But what could be more absurd? What could be more hypocritical, and indeed what could be more evil than to say that refusing circumcision, that to live without circumcision, is merely a form of white privilege that casts aspersions and casts a negative judgment on an indigenous tradition? And by the same token, what could be more absurd than saying using hand soap, using toothpaste, using toothbrushes, that this is merely a form of white cultural imperialism that's going to make indigenous people feel ashamed of their own traditions, of their own traditional lifestyles? What could be more absurd than making the excuse for eating meat than to claim, as this young man claims, that this is part of their traditional culture? And how dare you hold up a contrast between that indigenous tradition and, frankly, an outside set of influences and ideas?
It constitutes an unnecessary value judgment on things that may necessarily be like an important part of their culture.
I'm going to take a moment here to answer a hypothetical objection to this video. And it's a hypothetical objection I'm unlikely to get because I've already made so many other videos stating what my political position on indigenous culture is, First Nations culture, First Nations languages, the Cree and the Ojibwe, etc., within Canada especially, but it's an issue I've dealt with in Cambodia, Laos, even Taiwan. A lot of these countries do have the problem of colonized indigenous native minority people, definitely, where I was just living in Yunnan. Fascinating and important area of politics in the 21st century that I care about passionately. But someone might object, if this is the first video they'd ever seen on my channel, someone might hypothetically object, do you see nothing positive in these indigenous cultures? Do you see nothing worth saving in native traditions? And of course, you could ask the same thing about Judaism. Do I see nothing worth saving in Judaism just because circumcision is bad? My answer to that is twofold. One, when you think of culture, do you think of a weakness or a strength? I'm dead serious. Really think about it. Is your culture something holding you back? Is it dead weight? Is it a burden you're going to place on the shoulders of the next generation? Is it something bad and shameful and awkward? Or is it something that actually makes your life more meaningful, more wonderful? I mean, look at homophobia. Almost every culture in the world, not all, almost all, were intensely homophobic up until just a few decades ago. And this had to be challenged. And you know what's interesting? People thought that was a strength. People really thought having an intensely homophobic culture that celebrated a certain narrow idea of masculinity made them strong, made them tough, made them better as a people. And that's been challenged in just the last few decades. And no, we can have a culture that's warm and tolerant and accepting of homosexuals and a broad range of sexual identity expressions, sexual orientations, and we can still be as tough as we want to be. We can still win at the Olympic Games or fight pointless wars and drop bombs all over the world, whatever. You can butch it up as much as you want within a non-homophobic paradigm but people really thought that was a strength. And it was a big change in our way of thinking. It was a big change in our cultural paradigm to see that instead as a weakness. All right? So it's tough to think about these things that way. It's tough to think, is circumcision a strength or a weakness? Old pseudoscientific ideas handed down from your grandmother about health and hygiene and medicine. All kinds of cultural traditions all over the world. Maybe it makes you feel strong to carry on this tradition, eating something that turns out to be poisonous, that people used to think was a medicine, doing all kinds of things. Is this a weakness or a strength? And then point two is, if you're going to go through that cultural tradition and engage in cherry picking, if you're going to engage in the cynical selection of some elements of that cultural tradition to be preserved, as millions of Christians do. They leaf through the Bible and they cherry pick the elements of biblical Christianity that they want to preserve in the 21st century and the elements they either want to rationalize, make excuses for, or simply ignore. If there's something worth saving in Judaism, or Native American culture or Aboriginal Australian culture, it's not going to be circumcision, is it? It's not going to be slavery, is it? It's not going to be the status of women or the status of homosexuals in any of these culture traditions, is it? So given that we're cynically engaged in scrutinizing these traditions to select what's in and what's out by a 21st century standard, can we now start to engage in an honest and open-ended discussion of to what extent animal sacrifice, hunting, and meat eating belong in the dustbin of history, along with homophobia and the other oppressive elements of that traditional culture we want to discard, and to what extent it's going to belong in the 21st century.
À-bas-le-ciel.